So I'd like to add my welcome to everyone here. It's great to see so many people, and as Carol has said, without your support, it's very clear that much of the things that we're going to talk about today just would not be possible. So your support is invaluable to all researchers at Garvan. So what I was going to do today is spend the next sort of 15 minutes, perhaps 20 minutes, just talking about some of the things that we're doing from a skeletal health point of view. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about what our skeleton is really like as a sort of an educational exercise, and then secondly finish up by talking more about the types of research that we do. So I've called this the skeleton use it or lose it because you only have one skeleton. It's fundamentally important that you look after it, because if you don't, we all end up with significant musculoskeletal health issues. So it's something that's very important to be mindful of. Now, most of us will have seen sort of skeletons like this, and on the right-hand side, you've got a list of some of the things your skeleton does for you. So most of you will be familiar with the fact that it provides support. So it's really what distinguishes us from many other organisms, like jellyfish, for example. It what holds us up, and it provides protection for all our internal and vital organs, a system of levers which your muscles attach to help you move around, and then inside your bone is your bone marrow, and that's where your blood cells are produced. And what we're probably most familiar with is the fact that it provides a reservoir for calcium, which is obviously one of the most fundamental minerals in our body. And increasingly, research from some of my colleagues at Garvan has shown that the skeleton is very much an endocrine organ. It actually produces things that travel around the body to control other organs themselves. So it's an increasingly important organ in its own right. Now, typically, we have the amount of bone in our skeleton that we need. So as you get older, you deposit bone in your skeleton through your adolescence until you get to your mid-30s, and you get to the maximum amount of bone you typically have. But you can still adapt your skeleton, and we can see on the top left-hand side, this weightlifter here, if you put a lot of strain on your skeleton, you deposit more bone in your skeleton to resist that strain, so you're as strong as you need to be. If you go up into space, where we're in a sort of in the absence of gravity, you take away bone from the skeleton because you actually don't need it in the same way. And it's even more sensitive than that, because if you're a tennis player, you will have more bone in your right arm than your left arm. So your body is exquisitely sensitive to the amount of strain you put on it, and you can adapt your skeleton. So this is an important thing as we move forward. Now, the quality of bone is fundamentally important. So we can see that not only do you control the amount of bone you have, but you also control the quality of that bone. And if you look on the left-hand side, you have 3 bones there, and they look inherently the same. But as you see on the top panel, if you take away the calcium out of your bone, you have really bendy, flexible bones. But if you take away the collagen that is within your bone, you have a very different bone structure. It becomes incredibly brittle, as you can see there. And normally when I come and give talks like this, I bring these bones and get everyone to do this, but I think if you're sitting there having morning tea, it's probably not your best move to be playing with those. And we have taken them to places, and people have tried to eat them, because they thought that they were something to eat. So we have to be very careful these days. So the amount of bone and the quality of that bone is critically important. And it's controlled by a number of cells in your skeleton. And one of the cells that's most important is this cell here. It's called an osteoclast, and it's a cell that breaks bone down. So you can see just on here, this cell sort of sitting here, and around this area here is a lump of bone that's been resorbed away or taken away by this particular cell. And then if we look into the bone in more detail, we find that there are different types of cells that sit on the bone surface. And those cells are called osteoblasts, and these are the cells that make new bone. And we can see them just lying along the bone surface here, these dark stained cells. So they make new bone. And what happens in all of us, at any one moment in time, there are places in our skeleton where you're taking away bone, which might be mechanically less competent, and replacing it with fresh new bone by these cells. And this occurs in this sort of cycle of events called bone remodeling. And it begins with an osteoclast resorbing an amount of bone, and then that disappears, and it's replaced by the osteoblasts, and they synthesize and make new bone to replace the bone that's been taken away. So you can imagine that if you have a defect in the numbers of osteoclasts, for example, or you don't replace the amount of bone that was resorbed, you can gradually lose bone from your skeleton. So understanding how these two processes work is fundamentally important to understanding how diseases develop in our skeleton. Now, what we're interested in here at Garvan is a number of diseases. You can see these movies at the bottom. One of the most important diseases is osteoporosis, and we can see on the left-hand side, we can see the interconnecting plates of bone within your skeleton, and in the middle you can see the loss of what happens when you lose bone. It becomes a lot more porous and you lose some of the mechanical integrity. And that's one of the reasons why if you have osteoporosis, you're more prone to having fractures of your skeleton. Now, the other areas that we're interested in are cancers that grow in bone. And there are some cancers, such as the blood cancers like multiple myeloma, which give rise to a very characteristic bone disease. And there are other tumours or other cancers, such as breast and prostate cancer, which will metastasize or spread from your primary cancer to the skeleton. And once they're in the skeleton, they become very difficult to treat, and they can often cause quite profound effects on the skeleton themselves. So we're interested in these major disorders of the skeleton, and although they might appear very different in many respects, they actually have very common both mechanisms that give rise to the skeletal problem. So they all affect osteoclasts and osteoblasts and the cells that control those. Many of the molecules that we've now discovered that control the behavior of osteoclasts and osteoblasts are important in osteoporosis as well as in cancers that grow in the bone. And some of the therapies that we've been successful in developing over the last decade or so are as effective in treating osteoporosis as they are in treating the cancers that grow in the skeleton. So it's very often possible to learn lessons from one disease area and apply it to the other. So that's why we have this sort of overlapping Venn diagram. And what we have is two major programs in the bone biology division, one focused on osteoporosis and the other focused on cancers that grow in bone. Now today I'm just going to focus on, in the next 5 or 6 minutes or so, just talking a bit more about osteoporosis, but we're doing very similar projects looking in breast cancer, prostate cancer, and also multiple myeloma. So what do we know about osteoporosis? Well, osteoporosis is one of those diseases that has received rather little attention. It doesn't have the profile of a cancer or neurological diseases or cardiovascular disease. It's often regarded as a silent killer. So there is a new fracture occurs in the Australian population every 3 to 4 minutes. So someone across Australia in the time that I've been speaking will have undergone at least one new fracture. There are 1.2 million people in Australia with osteoporosis, and some 6 million people are seen to have what we call poor bone health. So they're at risk of having or developing both osteoporosis and having pathological fractures. And what is quite striking is half of women over 50 will go on to have an osteoporotic fracture in their lifetime. And something that we didn't really understand until one of the studies that was initiated here at Garvan is that a quarter of men over 50 will also have an osteoporotic fracture in their lifetime. And what is even more striking, and I'll get all these horrible figures out of the way now, so it's not all depressing, is that this is associated with premature mortality. So we've started to understand that if you have osteoporosis and you fracture your bones, this can be associated with effects on mortality as well. And you're more likely to die of an osteoporotic fracture than you are of breast cancer. And most people will have no perception of that whatsoever. Everyone believes that breast cancer is a big killer, but the work that's gone on with some of my colleagues at Garvan has revealed that actually osteoporosis is just a bigger problem, if not more of a problem. So what are we doing about that? Well, One of the big challenges we face in Australia and globally is that we have a very poor understanding of how bone is lost from our skeleton. We've started to understand some of the cells that are important and how they may control that process, but we understand very little about the genes that control our skeleton. We can't really successfully predict who is going to have a fracture. We really need to develop tools that are going to give us the ability to say, well, if you have this particular perhaps genetic makeup or you have these particular risk factors, this is your likelihood of having a fracture. And we've got a tool that Garvan has developed that is making a lot of progress in that direction, but we're not where we need to be yet. We don't have any treatments yet that are licensed that will allow you to put bone back into your skeleton. We have a limited number of drugs, and those drugs are arguably not even getting to the people that should benefit from those. So only 20 to 30% of individuals that could benefit from treatment actually get the drugs they need. And those treatments are stopping bone from getting worse. What we really need is drugs to be put back into your skeleton to make your bones stronger, so you're more resistant to fracture. And one of our biggest challenges is that the public understanding of skeletal health is less good than it needs to be. So these are some of the challenges we're faced with. And what we're trying to do is address each of those here at Garvan. And I'm going to show you some examples of one or two of those things and finish off with one public awareness campaign that you can all go away and hopefully do later on. So in terms of the research that we do, research in Australia into musculoskeletal health is incredibly competitive. And it's arguably as good as anywhere in the world. And people perceive the researchers in Australia, whether it's at Garvan, at Concord, down in Melbourne, research here in Australia punches well above its weight internationally. We're highly connected internationally, and most of the researchers, both here at Garvan and certainly down in Melbourne, lead major international consortia aimed at understanding your skeleton. We've already had some success based around the Dubbo osteoporosis study, which I'll mention in a moment, in predicting who is likely to have fractures in the future. But one of the big steps that we need to take is really understand the genetics of osteoporosis. And one of the things that Garvan has been successful, it did discover the first gene that contributes to the development of osteoporosis some 20 years ago. But that was one gene out of there's probably 20,000 protein coding genes, and we know of one that might contribute. Mm-hmm. In the last 20 years, another 15, 20, 30 genes have been discovered, but we really need to map the whole landscape to understand all the genes. And the reason why that is important, not only can it be helpful in helping us predict who's going to have fractures, but it helps lead to new treatments. And this is the one drug that's been developed over the last 10 years that will put bone back in your skeleton. And although it's not licensed yet, it is a drug that's likely to be licensed over the next year or two and hopefully will become available. And this was made upon through an observation made in some individuals with a particular rare disease called Van Buchen's disease. And what became apparent, if you look at the skulls of these two individuals, you can see a normal skull on the top left-hand side, and then on the bottom left-hand side you can see the skull of an individual with this particular disorder. And this person has an enormously thick skull. So for some reason they're depositing too much bone in their skeleton. So they were discovered on the basis of that if you ran them down in a car, they wouldn't fracture their bones. They can't swim properly because they weigh too much. But what's happened is we've used this unusual example to work out that this person has a mutation in one gene, and that gene is called sclerostin. And what's happened is a company has now developed an antibody to that particular molecule, and that is now a treatment for osteoporosis. It's been through advanced clinical development, and hopefully it goes through the FDA in America and will become licensed as a treatment for osteoporosis. So what we're doing now to try and understand and map all the genes that are important in controlling our skeleton is to use two approaches, and this is one of them. This is using the so-called Dubbo Osteoporosis and Epidemiology Study, which is based out in the city of Dubbo. Some of you may be familiar with this, but this was a study that started 26 years ago. And essentially, individuals in Dubbo have been followed every 2 years where their bone density has been measured. We've taken lots of measurements, and we've used this to actually understand both about osteoporosis in men. We've discovered the importance of fractures and mortality. We've worked out this fracture risk calculator that is now available to be used, and we're starting now to understand the genes that control the skeleton. And one of the challenges with that is that for many years we just didn't have the technology to do this. So we can see we had some technologies. So this is a picture on the left-hand side, and we can see in the center of that picture, you can just make out a little part of it. So we had a technology that would allow us to look in detail at a very small part of the genome. And then we had another technology that would allow you to look at a very low level, and you could just about make out the shadow of an individual there. But now we've got this really exciting new technology that is now based in this building, just probably 25, 30 meters away. This really exciting new technology that allows you to look at incredibly high resolution and sequence the entire genome of an individual. So now we can reveal the whole landscape of our gene. We can see the complete picture for the very, very first time. And across the corridor from here, we have a number of machines that will read an individual's genome. And we've now sequenced over 10,000 individuals' genomes in the last year or a little over a year. So we're now bringing this exciting new technology to bear on the Dubbo study. This is one of those machines. We have 10 of them. They're pretty ugly boxes. You wouldn't know what they did, but these are incredibly powerful machines. And what we're now doing is sequencing individuals' genomes from the Dubbo osteoporosis study. And we've already identified some new genes that are important in making people's bones stronger. And we're trying to characterize those genes as we speak. So that's one approach. The second approach is an international collaboration, and this is with the Sanger Institute in Cambridge in the UK. And some of you may be familiar with the fact that the Sanger was one of the partners in the first genome sequencing project. And at that point, it took nearly 10 years to sequence a genome, and we can now do that in a matter of days. And it's a partnership between the Sanger and some of my colleagues at Imperial College in London and the Garvan Institute. And what we're trying to do is search for all the genes that are switched on in our skeleton. And what we've discovered over the last year is that there's a very precise number. 1,197 genes are switched on in the skeleton, and they're the genes that make your skeleton a skeleton. They are what distinguishes a skeleton from a liver or a brain or a heart. And 80% of those genes, no one had any idea that they were expressed or switched on in bone before. So now all of a sudden we've seen a much more greater scope to that landscape that we're talking about. And this analysis has already found entirely new genes that no one had ever seen before. So the skeleton expresses things that are not found in any other part of the body, which has given us new targets to think about in the context of new drug targets. So one of the key questions we're now trying to ask is which of these genes, of these 1,197, are the ones that are most important in causing diseases such as osteoporosis. So it's an exciting time from a genetic point of view. We're making real progress at the moment. One of the things that we are very keen to do is to start to make people aware of their skeleton. And we have this so-called Bone Alliance, which is a collaboration with Osteoporosis Australia. And what we've been doing is taking some of the discoveries from the Dubbo osteoporosis study, the fracture prediction tools, and making this available in a web-based format so people can do the test themselves. And it's called Know Your Bones, and we launched this last year. It was launched by Susan Lee. And we have this little video that I will show you, but essentially this is a tool that any one of you can go away and do, and it should tell you your likelihood of having a fracture in the future. And what is good about this tool is you can take the information to your GP and say, I've done this test. There are some recommendations here from experts in the field. some clinical experts about what I might think about doing. So it provides an opportunity for you to go to your GPs and talk about that. Hopefully you'll all go away and sign up and have a look at that. I thoroughly recommend doing it. As you can tell, I feel very strongly that everyone should look after their skeleton. So this is my last real slide. So what we're doing at the moment is there is a national action plan for osteoporosis, and we're trying to enact that. We're focused very, very strongly on on trying to understand the genes that control our skeleton and those that are responsible for the development of osteoporosis. And we're trying to integrate that information into predicting who will have fractures in the future and developing new treatments. And obviously, we're trying to make sure that everyone is aware of this Know Your Bones campaign. So what we're really trying to do is make sure we see less images like this and see more images like this, okay? So I expect everyone to be doing this by the end of the afternoon. All right? So I'm going to stop there, but obviously I want to thank it. This is very much a combined effort. So these are many of the individuals within our Garvan Bone division, and we're obviously supported by a range of people, particularly through philanthropy as a major source of our income here at Garvan. So I want to thank you for your time, and I'm really happy to answer any questions you might have.